Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our audience across different time zones. We're covering the US, Europe, the Mediterranean, Gulf countries, and India. Welcome to ELIAMEP and its Mediterranean program to discuss a new geopolitical and economic corridor connecting India and Europe through the Gulf countries, the Mediterranean, and to Europe through Greece. I would also like to welcome our esteemed speakers. We'll cover geopolitical and socioeconomic data analysis for an informed perspective on the issues that we will address. Let me create some context to our discussion today. Announced at the recent G20 summit by President Biden and endorsed by the US, of course, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, Italy, and the EU, the significance lies in the geoeconomics of new alliances, new corridors of trade, and interconnectivity. This new India-Europe corridor will determine access to trade routes and resources, which is what drives foreign policy and security these days. So in our meeting today, our webinar today, we will discuss whether the project will retain its momentum given the re-emerging conflict in the Middle East. Could the whole project be derailed, given that there might be long-term ramifications as trust might erode among the indispensable partners? Can a positive agenda retain its importance at a time of conflict and humanitarian crisis? Can Greece be the convener that maintains momentum of the possibilities for collaboration between India and Europe? What are the economic dynamics underpinning this geopolitical agenda? The Mediterranean remains the least connected region in the world. 500 million people producing 10% of global GDP, but only a quarter of its trade is intra-regional. This weakens its presence in global value chains and supply chains. The Mediterranean needs more multilateral partnerships. At this time of conflict, we feel that holding this webinar is important to emphasize the necessity of keeping the dialogue open, possibilities open, and reminding the world that we can be more peaceful if interconnected interests are more, not less. So we have 6 esteemed speakers to enlighten us with their insights on this matter for the next hour. And we have a remaining time of 15 to 30 minutes to answer questions and follow up on comments. We thank our audience for joining us. Let me begin with Ambassador Kourkoulas. Ambassador, for years you have served as a European diplomat and as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greece in charge of economic diplomacy. Currently, you direct the Mediterranean program of ELIAMEP. Do you think the EU and Greece can mobilize allies to keep interconnectivity options open with India, Gulf, and the Mediterranean countries? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cleopatra. I would like to thank you and ELIAMEP for inviting me in this very interesting webinar, which takes place, as we all know and feel, in a very challenging environment for our region and for the world peace. And I think it is not by a coincidence that we have speakers from different continents and from different time zones, because what we are discussing now is of paramount importance, not only for our region, but more generally for the world peace and cooperation. As you said, ELIAMEP has a very long tradition and continues to be very active in analyzing the risks and challenges in the Mediterranean geopolitical area. Since 1997, ELIAMEP has been part of EuroMESCO, which is the Euro-Mediterranean Study Commission network that concentrates on different aspects of Mediterranean security and Euro-Mediterranean cooperation. Our active participation in European and regional initiatives, particularly in the sphere of Euro-Mediterranean cooperation and security, constitutes still today a fundamental priority for ELIAMEP, and I'm very proud that a few months ago I have been nominated as head of the Mediterranean program. In the past few years, ELIAMEP has been very active in research projects in the area of renewable energy and territorial governance in the Mediterranean basin. Another successful activity has been the Summer Academy for training emerging leaders in the Mediterranean, which we have organized since 2021 in cooperation with the American College of Greece in Olympia, in Peloponnese, in the magnificent venue of International Olympic Academy. Currently, the major pillar of Mediterranean program is the Mediterranean Growth Initiative. This is a unique instrument that was created by Cleopatra Kitty, aiming at refocusing the lens of the Mediterranean through data and analysis covering the economies of all Mediterranean countries. We are proud as ELIAMEP that since 2020, we joined forces with the Mediterranean Growth Initiative, and we are further developing this unique instrument that promotes positive agenda and connectivity in the region. The MGI aims at investors, policymakers, analysts, as well as anyone who wants to gain an in-depth understanding of the region and its potential. We are currently finalizing a comprehensive plan for our activities in the MED program for the next 5 years. Our aim is the creation of a comprehensive research hub providing an in-depth analysis of the emerging challenges in the Mediterranean area, and we concentrate, of course, especially in the East Mediterranean region. The two priority areas of action would be energy and social sustainability. We aim to produce research on both the actual energy-related activities and the impact of the ongoing changes to the energy geopolitics of the region. It is, of course, obvious that the recent dramatic developments and the new geopolitical landscape will be taken into account for a necessary review of our program in the weeks and months to come. The region of the Mediterranean is characterized by a high interdependence, but at the same time, as Cleopatra already said, limited connectivity and untapped cooperation opportunities. Promoting cooperation and connectivity in the Mediterranean region was also the strategic objective of the Euromed process, also known as the Barcelona process, in the 90s. It was the period of high optimism for a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Barcelona process was aiming at multiplying the peace dividend and spreading it among all Mediterranean countries. This ambitious European strategy was based on the creation of a free trade area between EU and each of the third Mediterranean countries, with the aim of facilitating further integration of these countries in the EU economy. Another equally important objective of the Barcelona process was to promote trade and economic exchanges among Mediterranean countries, mainly among Arab countries, but also Arab countries and Israel, that were at that time and still today are extremely low, not only because of the Israeli-Arab conflict, but even among Arab countries. The Barcelona Declaration and the whole process was not limited to issues of trade and economic cooperation. It was aimed at promoting peace and stability in the region, promoting cooperation on social and cultural issues, with the ultimate aim of promoting understanding between different cultures. Today, we all know that those hopes were dust, and in a way that we see today in a very tragic way. The expected peace dividend that would have benefited the entire region did not come, because peace did not come. But it was even worse to come. The terrorist attack on the Twin Towers in New York, the US invasion of Iraq, the spread of radical Islam, the intensification of the confrontation between Shia and Sunni Islam, the bloody conflicts in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and of course, most recently, the economic collapse of Lebanon, all this has dealt a blow to the European ambition to promote European-oriented multilateral cooperation. The European Union's engagement in its southern neighborhood is not longer a matter of choice, but a strategic imperative in order to protect itself from the chaos that surrounds us every day more and more. The India-Europe corridor that we are going to analyze today could be an important component of the multinational cooperation between the European Union and the Middle East. In today's chaotic international environment and the increasing violence in our immediate neighborhood, economic diplomacy has become a very important tool for the EU and its member states to promote cooperation, to forge positive relationships, to build mutual trust and understanding, and create new opportunities for cooperation, growth, and development. Trade and investment relationships are among the most important channels through which countries interact with one another, and they can profoundly impact the broader strategic environment, reduce the risk of conflict, and create incentives for a peaceful resolution of disputes. Promoting economic diplomacy is important, but not sufficient in today's dangerously growing geopolitical realities. Geopolitical presence is of paramount importance, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, had promised a geopolitical European Commission and also I think what we need is also a more geopolitical European Union. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that the tragic events in the region since the 7th of October have exposed Europe's contradictions. The cacophony of EU voices concerning the EU aid to the Palestinians, which was first suspended and then restored. And then we had the image of 27 countries of the European Union split threefold at the UN General Assembly, with 8 countries voting in favor, 15 abstaining, and 4 voting against the Jordanian resolution. Of course, there is a long tradition of internal EU divisions on the Middle East. If these internal divisions persist today, I think I'm afraid that the European Union will be prevented for playing a constructive role in a world of fragmentation, conflict, and violence. And I think this could also be an obstacle for the further development of this very, very, very important initiative of India-EU corridor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You were very much on time, and thank you for giving us an overview of the Mediterranean-EU relations as well as the possibilities. So the question for the speakers that follow will be to spot the opportunity and the possibilities. So Ambassador Tribunayat, You have served as senior diplomat of India in the MENA region amongst your other missions. Do you consider this new economic corridor as an imperative for India? And at this time of conflict, do you think India will persevere its efforts to connect to Europe through the Gulf and to Greece? Do you think diplomacy can prevail? The floor is yours, sir.
Good evening. Thank you, Madam, for this very kind invitation. Excellencies and distinguished panelists, it's a great pleasure for me to be a part of this very informed discussion on a very important topic. And as Ambassador Corpola said, I fully agree and subscribe to his views. You are aware that this IMEC corridor proposal was signed in New Delhi during the G20 summit by India, Europe, and Saudi Arabia, UAE. And when you look at this from India's perspective, you can look at it from 3 points of view, whether it is a counter to the BRI, whether it is an additionality to the BRI, or it is another alternative for the India's, Russia and Iran's international north-south transport corridor. Connectivity is the key to trade, economy, global value supply chains, as well as in a strategic dimension, if we were to look at it. I look at this as an additionality for India. It wants to have a corridor through the French, where it can connect to Europe, which is a major market for India. You all know that UAE is India's third largest trading partner, and Saudi Arabia is India's fourth largest trading partner. And all the 5 countries, if you leave aside Jordan for a moment, are all India's strategic partners to Greece. We have already got sea lanes. We have other connections via UAE and other places which are connecting to Europe. Trade is continuing, investments are continuing. But at the same time, to have this kind of a shortest possible route, which could give some kind of a benefit to the traders and to others, it will be very important from India's perspective and from Arab and the European perspective as well. And this is more important in the kind of global scenario which is emerging, which could be perhaps some kind of a Cold War 2.0 in that. So you know that as soon as this proposal was launched, and it, of course, it came out of the US, basically in their Build Back Better, which was taking off nowhere. So you look at every country in the region and you will realize that each one has its own geopolitical and geoeconomic reasons for being part of this corridor. Each one is looking at it in a very different way. But from India's point of view, this is to provide some kind of an insulated corridor through a very volatile geography. And that is the problem. The Middle East is a volatile region. The maximum number of hotspots are lying there. And it is also, for India, is an existential region because we depend a great deal for our energy security, for the economic development, for maritime lanes, for India's diaspora, which is over 9 million people remitting about $60 billion to India every year. So it's very important. So now you see we have great relations with Israel. We have very good relations with all the countries. And as I said, the rest of them are all our major strategic partners. So India is committed to continue in this. Now, this, of course, was dependent because it was expected by the US and some others that this would lead to some kind of a normalization on the same pattern as the Abraham Accords between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that was also the statements that were coming out of here. A few months before that, we had seen that Saudi Arabia and Iran, with the mediation of China, had normalized their ties and they were going forward. Palestinian issue, in my view, is a 100-year-old issue. And I always maintain that until and unless this issue is fundamentally resolved, you are not going to have a stability in the region, as we have seen in the recent conflict which is continuing right now. So it's important that the countries in the region do work on it. But what was happening is that if Saudi Arabia had normalized the relations like the UAE and others with Israel, which was heading towards that, and we heard Netanyahu at the UNGA claiming it, and even Crown Prince Salman mentioned that we are inching closer. The fact is that Palestinians would have lost their cause completely in this. And that was the fear, and I think a trigger for both Iran and for Hamas to have taken this particular, at this juncture, to taken this kind of an attack. So that was precisely. So they have achieved their objective. Saudi Arabia has already said that we are putting everything on a pedestal at the moment. They will wait for some time. But my feeling is that it might delay the project. In any case, the project would have taken minimum 10 years because the 1,500-kilometer railway line is to be laid. Jordan, they have a very big old line, which is Hijaz Railways, that needs to be upgraded to the same pattern. The customs regulations and others have to be worked out between various countries in the region. So it will not just start smoothly working like that. And we have seen from the experience of INSTC, I was in Moscow in 2000 when we launched it. And it is still partially working. It has not come on full steam. And of course, nowadays it's because of the US and other sanctions from the West that it is not working so much. But this is very much an option for India that continues to remain in the picture. Now, whether India will continue in the current situation, that was one of the key aspects of your question is. So I would like to just tell you that just last week, my Prime Minister Modi, was talking at this maritime summit. And he said there that like the Silk Route of the past that accelerated the global economy, the IMEC will transform the picture of new global trade. And he also said that India will be taking up several projects, such as the development of the next generation megaport, international container transshipment port, island development, inland waterways, and multimodal hubs as a part of the cross-country economic corridor plan. And the operation of this corridor will result in reduction in cost of business, improve logistical efficiency, cut environmental degradation, and create jobs. And this is a great opportunity for investors to become part of this campaign and join India. Now, this was basically there were a large number of investors, both Indian and foreigner. And you all know that Haifa port in Israel is currently owned partly by an Indian company called Adani. And so from there, it directly has to go to the Piraeus port in Greece. So to a great extent, India's linkages with the region up to Europe already exist, and they need to be honed once the Middle Eastern corridor is taken care of. So India is continuing and going forward, building its own, as it is called, it was supposed to be a green and digital bridge, and a hydrogen and cables and all kinds of things. So from its part, India is working. It is currently the 5th largest economy. By 2030, set to become the 3rd largest economy, want to be a part of the global value supply chains. So it wants these corridors that are going to be safe and will provide that kind of a security for Indian businesses directly through the major markets in the world. Of course, there are other things. Apart from this, you know that Turkish president immediately on announcement of this, he said this is a stillborn because Turkey is not involved then, and without Turkey, this trade is going nowhere. And the dynamic between Turkey and Greece also has something to play out, apart from what is happening on the Palestinian issue. Then Egypt, which has been basically the major source through the Suez Canal, is also another competitor for this particular, that also needs to be looked at it. Thirdly, the other important part of this whole project, which was not really discussed, and they were supposed to discuss now through various working groups, was how the funding will be done. Because money only makes the mayor go. Now, who's going which part and how, from where the money is going to come? Jordan, for example, has no money. So it has to be fully funded. Perhaps the GCC is planning to have their own railways network. Perhaps that network can eventually plug in Can there be some way out? Because at the moment, the Arab street is fully charged. And that's one goal that the Hamas has achieved by creating this kind of a rift between the leadership of these countries and their street, and which will be very difficult to overcome and overpower. And that's why we are seeing, whether it is UAE or whether it is Saudi Arabia or Jordan for that matter, they are all hands off at the moment from this. Although yesterday, Mr. Al-Nuaimi from UAE had mentioned that as far as the Abraham Accords are concerned, they will not be impacted by this war, ongoing war. But we have to see, we have not seen the end of this war. We don't know which way it's going. If it conflagrates further in the region, I think we are going to have major difficulties. So a lot depends on how the United States eventually behaves. Because as was mentioned, that European Union does not have much say at the moment. I even propagate here in India that at the moment, India is the only country probably in the region which has some kind of a trust with both Israelis as well as Palestinians. So once the dust settles down, the day after, India will have to, if it can, start some kind of a move. And that remains to be seen whether India does or does not do. Now, that will be for the government to decide. But I think we can play a very constructive role in this region, because this region and its stability and security is of paramount importance to us. So I'll leave it here. I'll be very happy to take any other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Trikunayat. Very prescient comments and very encouraging. Given the economic aspect, the trade aspect, and the geopolitical aspect. Ambassador Zepos, you are a seasoned diplomat and you have served as Greece's ambassador to India. Can you please give us your view on the geopolitical value of this economic corridor between India and Europe through Greece? It places a significant role on Greece's diplomacy to pursue it. Is it possible for Greece to do so and engage allies both in the Gulf, in Israel, and in the EU? The floor is yours, sir. You are muted, Ambassador Zepos, if you can unmute, please. Thank you.
Thank you to Eliamep, and thank you to you, Ms. Kiti, for inviting me to this very interesting webinar tonight. And I must say that it's extremely interesting to see, along with us, a gentleman from Israel and an ambassador from India. It is something new. And, you know, I have been working for years with Eliamep, thinking that we have to expand our antennas towards India. And I'm happy that this is taking place. I think I would say a few words initially concerning the relation that binds Greece with India, because we are the furthest poles in this picture. So in the sense that it's a very old relation, we all know that. It starts in antiquity. We may not know that in the late 18th century and in the 19th, we had an important Greek community installed in India. They were living in Calcutta and in Dhaka. After independence, they started to leave. They were interesting people, amongst which there was a very notable Greek, Dimitrios Galanos, who is the first person who has written a Sanskrit, English, and Greek dictionary, and who is buried in Benares, in the holy city of Benares in India. So then on, we get into the 50s, where through the non-aligned movement and through the friendship between Bishop Makarios and Prime Minister Nehru, we have a bonding coming up where Greece also finds itself in the picture. So we start having a very close relation with India, because they support Cyprus always in all the international fora, including the UN. And then, we start building a closer relation. So we have a very good political relation with India. Our economic relations were not very good, but they are doing much better in the last 1 or 2 years, which is significant. And I think that we have entered a new phase, especially after the visit of Prime Minister Modi in Athens just a little while ago, and the talks he had with the Prime Minister Mitsotakis. the point is that just after that, a few days later, as we all know, the G20 convened in Delhi, and the issue of the corridor, of the economic corridor, came up and was accepted. This project probably, or the idea of some sort of a project of this sort, probably had been discussed when Prime Minister Modi was in Athens. So, and I know that from the Greek side, they're absolutely willing to find ways to build on this idea. And of course, both Ambassador Kourkoulas and Ambassador Trigouna were very clear in mentioning what the situation is in the Mediterranean and in the Arab world. Obviously, I will say that it is not the ideal moment to think of building, because we have, first of all, to face the situation and try and get out of it in a positive way, so that it won't expand and it won't become more dangerous. All this was very well analyzed by both these gentlemen. So I hope, first of all, it's an excellent idea, this economic corridor that can lead all the way up to Greece. Many countries can be part in this project. We're not, the idea is not to exclude, but to include countries in this project. But let's hope that the geographical situation in the areas where this corridor is supposed to go through will be such as to allow tomorrow a more sort of viable and positive outcome of the whole idea that was decided in New Delhi very recently. So again, I do believe that because speaking also on our bilateral relation, as you know, when Prime Minister Modi was here, it was decided after many years of efforts that we should start building a strategic relation with India, which is something that other governments some years ago also were trying to work on, but the timing was not the right one because we were still in our economic crisis, so it was very difficult to make planning, or important planning. But we have always been on India's side on the bilateral diplomatic political, and we also supported India even when the nuclear tests took place in 1998. We were among the few countries, even within the EU, Ambassador Kourkoulas definitely knows about this, where we supported India. We were on India's side. We did not go along with the majority of our EU partners. So I think that we have, thinking of the two poles, as I mentioned at the beginning, Greece and India, we have two centers that I think are now looking positively towards one another, discovering still one another. I can't say that we have fully discovered India, nor India has fully discovered Greece, but all this lends a hand to the idea of this corridor that can, and I'm sure will, if the political situation and the strategic and security situation allows, it can be a very interesting project for the future. And obviously it will be to the benefit of all parties involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Zepos. We keep the untapped potential of the two poles, India, Greece, and all the countries in between, to develop this new economic corridor. I'll move to Katerina Sokou. Katerina, you are a non-resident research fellow at ELIAMEP on Greek-US relations and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'll focus on the US side of this new opportunity of a geo-economic corridor. At the G20, as it was said, President Biden endorsed this new corridor, giving acknowledgement to the UAE for its initiative and support. Given the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, do you think the US will retain its intent on this corridor? And do you think it will be equally valuable to any US administration? Is it a strategic imperative for the US? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Cleopatra, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be among this distinguished group. I would like to start by saying that to your last question, this indeed has been a US policy that transcends specific administrations. The Abraham Accord started with the Trump administration, and the normalization, expanding it to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel has been very much a goal of the Biden administration, while of course keeping the Abraham Accords and building, I would say, on these to actually expand the regional cooperation in the region to include, of course, the India-Europe corridor, most lately. Now, the assumption of all these goals and exercises was that the Palestinian issue was no longer a wedge in normalization efforts between Israel and the Arab states. And it is true that the war has changed that. I do not share the view that the process is dead. There's been a lot of analysts that note that it is frozen for now. But it is true that the Palestinian issue is now back on the agenda. And it is a factor of consideration for Arab leaderships on how they approach Israel and their economic ties to Israel. Now, the US on its part hoped to cool off tensions in the region by working with its regional partners to build partnerships and by facilitating this normalization process. And of course, it also hoped to challenge the Chinese influence in the region and at the same time boost India's influence in the region by establishing this economic corridor that would link, of course, India, the Middle East, and Europe with Israel as a component, of course, in that important corridor. Now, the proposed project had two parts. Of course, the Eastern Corridor that would connect India to the Arab Gulf states, and a Northern Corridor that would connect the Gulf states to Europe. And that's where we are seeing the tensions append the project right now. I should note that if we need to see how the US will proceed going forward, it's obvious that right now all its diplomatic efforts and assets are very much, and not only the diplomatic assets, but also intelligence, military assets, are committed to supporting Israel. The US support for Israel is unequivocal. Just yesterday, we saw in Congress the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and the Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, appealing for more assistance for Israel, and of course, Ukraine at the same time. And on the US, the argument goes that these are all battles against aggression and terrorism that will define the global security for years to come. The Secretary of Defense said that the only firm American leadership can ensure that tyrants and terrorists worldwide are not emboldened to commit more aggression and more atrocities. So what we are saying is also the return of the US in this part of the world. And there is a real fear that this return that for now has the very strong characteristics of deterrence, the effort of the US to basically contain the war between Israel and Gaza and not expand and deter any actors from trying to expand the war by creating a second point of tension with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, or beyond that. This is something that is very much a concern and very high on the agenda of the US. So by all means, they have returned to the Middle East, but if anything, it is to contain the war rather than expand it and be part of it. And I should note here that we are 1 year to the US elections, right? And this is something that is very high on the agenda of both political parties right now in America. Domestic politics do play a role. Ahead of the elections, I was very interested to see a latest poll that shows that only 17% of Arabs support President Biden right now. It was 60% just two years ago in 2020, sorry. But they do make a very small part of the electorate, 5%. That being said, they could be the critical vote in some of the swing states. Of course, on the Republican side, the support for Israel is, I would say, even stronger than what it is in the Democratic Party. And right now, I guess there is a competition of who will, of the candidates for the Republican nomination to show who will show the biggest support for Israel and make them the most important or a comment that will actually persuade the Jewish people in the US to vote for them. So there is a real possibility for the conflict to widen, of course. But even if this doesn't happen, it has already triggered upheaval in the Arab world. And this would obviously hurt the US regional alliances, but also leave the door open for much deeper involvement in Russia and China. So still, I would say that the war has dealt a blow to the stabilization plans for the region, including, of course, at the moment for the India-Europe corridor. And the extent of this shift of the dynamics in the Middle East, I would note, will be determined at the end of the day by how long the war will continue and at what cost for civilian lives. One silver lining might be that after the war, the new reality on the ground may demand a return to the negotiating table with the ultimate goal of the creation of a Palestinian state. And if that were to happen, then it would lift this wedge once and for all, hopefully, between the Arab states and Israel, and create the conditions, as Ambassador Trigunayat said, for stabilizing the region so that we can work on these projects without being distracted by this issue. One final point that I found really interesting as regards India was that India abstained from the vote asking for a ceasefire at the UN, as it did not expressly condemn Hamas. And it is interesting because India has not recognized Hamas as a terrorist organization, in large part due to its ties with Arab nations. To me, this shows that there is a consideration about, of course, relations with Arab nations that is very important for India. I was seeing the data that total bilateral trade between India and the Arab nations is over 180 billion and growing, and another 30 billion are remittances coming from Arab countries, where 8 million Indians live. At the same time, 60% of India's crude oil imports are from Arab nations. So obviously the economic conditions for cooperation are there. And as the ambassador was saying just earlier, the argument for the economic corridors, for the shipping routes, is evident to all parties involved. So by the time that the situation stabilizes again, the economic rationale will still be there, and even if not stronger amid the crisis, to boost this corridor. So that's for me.
Thank you, Misoko. Thank you, Katerina. Excellent points, and thank you for touching on the economic realities and imperatives that drive geopolitical alliances that are much needed. Let me move on to Dr. Goren, who is in Israel, and at this time of conflict, that Israel is facing and the terrorist actions by Hamas. We condemn the atrocities on innocent civilians, Dr. Goren, and we wish that diplomacy and peace prevails. You are a senior fellow for Israeli affairs at the Middle East Institute, and you are the founder of our partner think tank, MITVI. We read, in spite of the intense conflict yesterday, the Israeli government licensed new exploration licenses for new blocks for oil and gas development. In this vein of economic and geopolitical priorities and diplomacy, do you think that this economic corridor will retain its potential and significance for Israel? What would it take to continue this new geo-economic diplomacy with India and Europe?
Thank you for these questions, and thank you for the invitation. I think even at times of war, and at very difficult times for Israel after the Hamas terror attack of October 7th, it's heartwarming to see friends around the world, and I think Israel is very much appreciate now the friendship with both India and Greece, but it's also important to keep like the positive agenda. And what you mentioned in your opening remark, I think is a very important concept, because we see so much zero-sum discourse emerging now in our region and beyond about what is happening. And it's important to keep an eye on the future and to make sure that once this is over, we can shape a better reality, bilateral, internal, but also regional and international. And this debate is exactly about a project that tries to do that. And you also mentioned the need for increased connectivity within the Mediterranean region. And that's vital as well, because we know the importance of the Mediterranean and how much this region is consolidating, but yet, as you mentioned, connectivity is low, and we are talking about connectivity opportunities that exist within the Mediterranean, between East and West of the Med. We know about connectivity that is between the Med and other regions, and now we hear about connectivity options in which the Med is kind of a go-between, like we see with the corridor idea. And the corridor idea is a meaningful one, and I think it generated interest in Israel, partly because it was implementing the concept of regional integration that Israel has been hoping for decades, and gradually is becoming something that is more and more realistic and could be attained. And you see how Israeli diplomacy over the last several years moved into mini-lateral configurations. So Israel traditionally preferred to have bilateral ties with countries. It refrained from groupings in which it was afraid it will face pressure on the two-state solution on the Palestinian issue. But over time, Israel grew to be at ease with minilateral grouping, and we saw it, whether it's the I2U2, whether it's the East Med Gaza Forum, even the Prosperity Project with Jordan and the UAE. So we saw all kind of these modalities take shape, which eventually serve the same goal of regional integration of different sorts and coalitions of like-minded states. And specifically, the connectivity that the corridor is talking about is something that was spoken about in Israel for some years. You have this idea promoted by Israel Katz about this railways for peace, which he presented several years ago. And by the way, he will return to the foreign ministry office in a couple of months because of a rotation. So there will be an ally for this project within the NFA, at least for a short time. We don't know how much this government will last after the war. Chances are that it will be replaced, but at least for now, you will have someone supporting it. And in general, it's supported across the political divide in Israel. It's not a project that is somehow a battle between left and right. Everybody sees the benefit of it. So Israel is on board with that. And it's also based on the openness that the Saudis have been gradually showing towards Israel. As was mentioned before, we see a process in which the Saudis, even before having a normalization agreement with Israel, are gradually opening up. We see more and more Israelis visiting Saudi Arabia in increasingly formal capacity. At first, it was business people with dual nationalism, and then it became all the way to ministers formally visiting. Of course, now everything is on hold, and we need to reassess. And therefore, your question about whether the project could be retained is very vital. We can look at the impact of the war until now and try to assess where it will lead to later on. And we see that, of course, regional configuration, also the minilateral one that I mentioned before, are not meeting now, are not moving forward. Things are stopped. They are not pulled back yet. So we don't see any announcement on the cancellation of any regional project. And that's a big, I think, difference to look at. Things are not advancing, but they are not being canceled. And they could have been an announcement about cancellation. We don't see those. We see lots of question marks about the notion that was initially becoming popular that Israel's regional relation will collapse because of the war. And this is not necessarily the case. Okay, the level of diplomatic ties that Israel enjoys with its regional neighbors did not change formally from the start of the war. We do see signs that are indicating negative developments. Just today, Jordan announced that it is calling back its ambassador from Tel Aviv for consultations. It's not an official downgrade of ties, but it's something that symbolizes that it's very difficult for Jordan to maintain relations with Israel as long as this war continues. We saw statements by Turkish President Erdogan, very hawkish, very threatening towards Israel, similar language that was voiced towards Greece, I think a year ago or maybe more. Again, not downgrading official ties yet. We hear from the Saudis about their interest once everything is over to continue advancing the relation with the US and the Israelis and advancing a two-state solution. And as was mentioned before, we hear statements coming from the UAE about the commitments to the Abraham Accords. So in general, the constellation that was in place before, if this crisis is contained and managed, and eventually when it is over, it's being over without spilling over to like a major regional conflict, it should be possible to relaunch it, but it will take some time, of course. And we need to acknowledge that. And the US activism now in the war and its coordination with Israel and support for Israel, I think will be important because for years it was concerned that the US is pulling back from the region, and the corridor ideas showed American interest to invest in the region, and the American involvement now in the war also showed that the US sees this region as a space of importance for its diplomacy and security interests. So we may see this American interest, of course, we don't know what will be with the elections, still in place. Now, we need to take into account Jordan. I mentioned it already. We used to look at the Saudis as the key for such a project. And I think the Saudis, their interest to continue is very much in place. But Jordan is a very sensitive spot. And you see Jordan and Egypt both very concerned about the fallout from the war, whether there will be any refugee flow or possible transfer that they think Israel may try to initiate. There is a big concern in Jordan for regional stability issue for the Palestinian population there. So to have Jordan on board for such a project may be becoming more difficult than to have the Saudis on board. So we have to maybe utilize the connections or the Arab Gulf states in a way to make sure that once the dust settles, Jordan will be there. And that relates to the configuration that will take place after this war, which is also relevant to this project, because there is now increased debate about the international component of the day after. Should Israel succeed in its war objective of toppling Hamas in terms of being the governing power in Gaza, assuming the PA, the Palestinian Authority, will not be capable of not interested of immediately taking over the Gaza Strip, there will be some buffer time in which the international community will need to pitch in which countries, including countries that are relevant to this project, will be involved. So there will always be another mechanism in which this unique configuration of states could be of contribution. And now it will have an additional component of looking into the Palestinian issue. So if in the past, this project was foreseen as something that could be done without a Palestinian component in it, now it could be added to be another way to try and advance any diplomatic process towards a two-state solution that will be in place after the war. And that may be intensified if indeed there will be leadership change in Israel that will bring a more moderate government than we have now. And it could also be connected to what the EU is trying to do with the Peace Day effort that it has launched with the Arab League and with Jordan and the Saudis and with Egypt about trying to look into the future and present a package of regional integration and incentives and benefits for a future of peace. So combining all of that together and making sure this project is continuing, but is continuing in a way that also serves Israeli-Palestinian peace process, which is now difficult to imagine, but probably will be back on the table once things are happening, of course, not with Hamas, but with a different, moderate, capable, legitimate Palestinian leadership. I think that will be a benefit not only for the project success, but also for the chances of us being more at peace with our neighbors.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for this dynamic input, Nimrod. You pointed out how the day after for Gaza could be a linchpin for the future of this project, which is a very interesting lens to consider. But I also keep the possibility of Israel retaining its next day post this conflict, the impact and keeping alliances in place for its future. I'm going to turn to Dr. Anastasatos, who will give us the economic analysis side of this corridor. Dr. Anastasatos, you are the Group Chief Economist at Eurobank. Eurobank is a leading Greek bank with a regional presence and international business reach. Thank you for joining us today. Eurobank considers India as a key growth market. How do you see this corridor contributing to Greece, your international business, and what are the key dynamic economic indicators that determine this corridor important? The floor
Good evening, good morning to everybody. Thank you for the invitation, Ms. Kitty. I'll try to use the time we have in our disposition to give some economic context, and in particular, an overview about the magnitudes of the economies involved, their relative strengths, their dynamics, but also challenges facing these economies. And I will argue that both these strengths and these challenges give the motive, provide the economic motive for the corridor to go ahead. Because obviously geostrategic considerations are very important for such an initiative to start, but a direct economic motive is always important for this to go ahead. Because let's not forget that in order for this to go on, we'll need a lot of investment in land transportation, sea transportation, energy connections, bilateral trade links. This is a lot of work, a lot of money. So having a direct economic motive always helps. And I'll try to argue that this economic motive indeed is there for both sides, for all sides actually involved. So let me give you some numbers. Hopefully we can maintain the attention of our audience without many numbers. But I think it's important to notice, beginning with India, the sheer size of the countries, the economies involved. Now, India, as I mentioned, is the fifth largest economy in the world, but if seen in purchasing power parity terms, this is already the third largest economy in the world after US and China, accounting for 7.2% of the world GDP, with a USD 11.2 trillion GDP in 2022. And the prospect is that because of the very rapid growth of this country, the share of India's economy in the world economy will increase rapidly from just 5.7% in 2010 to 8.8% in 2028, in just 18 years. Now, India's GDP over those of the EU and the US will almost double in these spells of time. The GDP per capita conversion will also be there. It will be a bit slower, obviously, given demographics, but it will be there. And this is a very strong motive from a European and a US side as well, given that this increase in per capita GDP will give rise to a new middle class, which actually is estimated to count above 300 million people, which in addition have a Western twist in their habitual and nutritional customs. And they provide a very large market for Western firms. This is an opportunity for Western firms. But I'll argue this holds the other way around too. Now, India is growing very dynamically. In 2021, it grew by a mighty 9.1%, 7.2% in 2022, and expected to subside to close to 6%, still very high in comparison to Western standards. And it will be instrumental in engineering convergence in the years ahead. Inflation is a bit increased, but under control. Expect again to subside gradually in the zone of 4% up to 2026. The fiscal front comprises some challenge for the Indian economy, considering that a general government deficit of close to 9% will appear in 2023. Now, this has been the case in some years in the past, which gave rise to public debt that surged close to 90% of GDP in 2020, which by emerging market standards may consider to be a bit high. On the other hand, the bulk of this public debt is being held by domestic investors, so the rollover risk is rather low. But it underlines the need for sustaining a prudent fiscal position. The current account is less edgy, with a current account deficit estimated in the vicinity of 2% in the years ahead. But again, with FDI flows being instrumental in sustaining the external position, as well as sustaining growth via investment. So for India, having access to Western markets for capital, either in the form of FDI or portfolio flows, is instrumental for growth. And having access also to know-how is instrumental for increasing the productivity of the economy, which in turn is instrumental for India to reach its goals. I remind our viewers that India has set the goal of reaching a developed economy status by 2047, which translates into a goal of 8% yearly growth for the next 20 years, a rather optimistic goal. But this is supported by demographic indicators, with India having a very large and very young population, but needs a lot of investment and needs know-how, and also needs access to mature markets. I remind that the EU is the largest market in the world in terms of purchasing power. So I think the motive is there from the Indian side as well. The challenges facing the Indian economy, apart from those already mentioned, I think includes the population density, which poses some challenges onto the infrastructure of the country, and the possibility of adverse weather conditions aggravating as the climate changes takes its toll, and putting some strain onto the agricultural components of the GDP. A similar situation holds for the Gulf countries as well. The Gulf countries already have a respectable share in world GDP, 3.6% in the recent years. So they are already quite big. However, they face some challenges in terms of relative growth when compared to the US and the EU, and this emanates from the fact that they still, up to date, despite heavy efforts, have a reliance onto oil-related growth, while non-oil related sectors still lag behind a bit in terms of productivity. And this is translated into some growth rates predicted for the near future that are a bit more sluggish than other countries in the area. So in order to cover that, which emanate from productivity gaps in the non-oil sector, they will need, again, access to know-how, access to markets, and interconnectivity. On the positive side, due to oil revenues, the Gulf countries obviously run very large, sizable current account surpluses. The area ran surpluses in the vicinity of 10% of GDP in the previous year. So this all supports with the fund availability the transition effort. But let's be clear, the transition effort is going to be lengthy. It's going to be demanding, given that the countries of the area are still plagued by certain lags in productivity and economic structures, including over-reliance on the public sector, underdevelopment on the private sector, and lack of economic diversification. So again, the corridor there provides some very valuable degrees of freedom in diversifying away from oil and interconnecting with other economies in the area. So in this respect, it's important to see that both the Gulf countries, as well as India, as Ambassador Trigoyanagat explained for a while, see the effort of the IMEC corridor as an additionality to other efforts already existing and not as a competing effort. Because they seem, for example, in the case of the Gulf area, that several national projects, such as, for example, the Saudi Arabian 2030 project or the Kuwait 2035 project, are running already. So adding some further requirements in infrastructure building and trade links, etc., is going to be a demanding task. As a final note on that, let me say something about trade links. Trade links are important, but not as important as one would expect, given the size and the relative importance of these areas in global trade. Just to give you an example regarding Greece's trade ties with the areas. Greece's trade volume with India, for example, was 1.3 billion in 2022, just a bit up from 2016, which is respectable, but still a lot of potential there to go up further. However, the potential is recognized. I remind our audience that already several Indian firms are investing in Greece, including JMR Airport, which is involved in the airport of Crete, the Swiss group, which is behind the acquisition of several Greek brands of funds, and let me add to that Eurobank's initiative to open a representative office in 2024 in India, as well as the efforts to form a memorandum of understanding with Indian small and medium-sized enterprises chamber. The same is true about the Gulf region as well, with Greek exports to the area being just 3.3% or 700 million, 3.3% of total of 700 million. Again, I think there is a lot of upside potential in the bilateral trade there. So again, I think it is very well documented that the economic rationale is there for materializing the corridor, but it's going to take much more than good intentions and diplomatic talks. It's going to take a lot of investment in infrastructure and in bilateral agreements, and the economic rationale and geostrategic stability are requirements for this effort. But I'm relatively optimistic that, given the rationale, the elements are there for this to happen in the years ahead.
Dr. Anastasatos, thank you very, very much. It was very prescient to hear of the pragmatic numbers and the potential that exists both as self-interest on behalf of the Gulf region and India, but also of Europe and the US in tapping into this growth potential of these regions. Before we conclude our session, I just wanted to ask Ambassador Trigunayat if you have any additional comments on behalf of the India perspective, having heard Nimrod, Katerina, Ambassadors Koukulas and Zepos, and Dr. Anastasatos' analysis.
Thank you very much. Very fascinating and comprehensive comments by all the distinguished panelists. But if I may add to what Ms. Katerina said about India's vote at the UNGA, there are two components. As far as India is concerned, it has a consistent policy of supporting a two-state solution with a sovereign state of Palestine living side by side with Israel. Israel is our strategic partner, a very close partner. And at the same time, we also understand and we promote this idea that resolution to this problem is very, very important. As far as Israel and Hamas was, you are right. India has not officially declared Hamas as a terrorist organization. But if you remember on October 7th when it happened, my Prime Minister was perhaps one of the first leaders to have conveyed his fullest solidarity and condemned these terror attacks. They were called terror attacks on civilians, Israeli civilians, because civilians were involved in that. So that was the first one. 2-3 days later, the Indian spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs restated India's position with regard to this, because it conveyed certain meanings that India has perhaps abdicated the cause of Palestine. That was not true. And thirdly, when this Al-Ahli hospital was bombed, Prime Minister Modi again tweeted and sent his, condolences and expressed his concern about the welfare of the civilians who were killed in this. And not only that, India immediately sent relief supplies, one of the first countries to send the relief supplies also for the Gaza Strip, even though we don't recognize the Hamas government, we don't deal with them at all. But this was done through Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas, Prime Minister Modi spoke to Mahmoud Abbas, he spoke to King of Jordan, he spoke to President Sisi, and tried to talk. Then our minister spoke to all his Saudi, UAE, and other counterparts. So India is trying to ascertain the position that how it can be done. But of course, we do recognize Israel's right to defend itself, as well as to take action against the terror acts. There is no doubt about it. And you know why? Very simply put, India is one country, as Ambassador Zepos will attest to that, has been suffering from terrorism forever, for the last 40, 50 years. United States only recognized terrorism after 9/11. Before that, they all used to choose between my terrorist and your terrorist. They will help Taliban grow up. Some other countries will help some other terror organizations grow up because they were not impacting them. It's only then. So India believes in the zero terror policy, and it has dehyphenated its foreign policy between Israel and Palestine. That does not mean that that means that India's relations with Palestine stands on its own, and India's relations with Israel stand on their own, which was not the case until 2014. So we are now looking at a possibility, if we can help somehow, some kind of a solution can be helped, provided, of course, both sides are agreeable. Now India stands for that. That is one. Secondly, for ceasefire, for other things, we were all there. But there was no mention of these terror acts which triggered all this at this time, at least. I mean, we can go into the history and justify. That's a very different kind of a thing. But this particular thing, so when you are talking a resolution in the UN, whether it is in UNGA or UN Security Council, if you're not mentioning that word terror at all, forget about even if you are not mentioning Hamas. And I know why the countries did not want to mention Hamas, Jordan and others. The simple reason is, if Hamas, which has not been so far recognized as a terror group by the United Nations, and if the UNGA includes it in this, so it automatically stands becoming an international terror organization. So far, only the Western countries have recognized it as a terror organization. So I think I will clarify on that.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's also very clarifying. I just wanted to say, don't get me wrong, Greece also abstained from that UN vote. It wasn't meant as a criticism, but as an observation.
No, I was not thinking it's a criticism. I was just saying that the rationale of it. Because what you said is something that many people started saying, that what was the reason? I mean, the fact is that if, suppose they said that because of the terror acts happened, we condemn the whole world, or this resolution had said that, without even mentioning Hamas, India would have gone through.
Same as Greece.
In Cyprus, for that matter. So, Ambassador Kourkoulas, you have your hand up.
Well, I just wanted to point out that we are still at the very beginning of this conflict, which is not has another not only quantitative but qualitative features than other Israel-Hamas or Israeli-Palestinian conflicts that took place in Gaza or elsewhere. I am afraid, and I believe that this will change completely the geopolitical landscape as we knew it. And unfortunately, it will make our efforts as Europeans or as Westerners to build bridges with the Arab world that were very successful in the last 10, 20, 30 years. So we will make these efforts more difficult. And this will be a very big problem for us, but also for Israel as well. So I am afraid that the minds and hearts of a big part of the Arab and Muslim populations, even the moderate ones, the breach between us and them will become bigger. And I think this will also have, might also have the geoeconomic consequences. Of course, I'm not a prophet, and I think nobody can foresee what will be the end of this conflict. If there is an extension to the north of Israel and involvement of Hezbollah, etc., of course, we all understand that this will make things even more tragic. But I think we should just for a while be very cautious. I'm as a diplomat, I have been always saying a two-state solution, and this was always, let's say, the dogma of the European Union. Personally, I doubt if this is possible anymore. I'm not saying it's not. It is perhaps the only solution I can see myself, but I'm not sure that it will be possible, at least for the many years to come, even to start discussing on this. So I would say I'm more pessimistic than I normally am as a diplomat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kourkoulas. We are almost to closing time. I'm giving the word to Ambassador Zepos in case you have any concluding comments, Ambassador. You're on mute, Ambassador.
Very close to what has been mentioned already. What I fear is the Arab street. I'm very upset with the perspectives of the Arab street, because the regimes can control that to a certain extent. If it blows much further, it will be very difficult to control, and things might turn much worse than they are today. So I think that everybody should try and keep it within some boundaries, all players, including Israel, of course, so that they don't work in the sense of supporting and helping the Arab street go to an extreme where the governments will not be able, they will have to bend. And therefore, after that, the Abraham Accords and the eventuality of other things, positive things happening in the future, will go far.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador. Nimrod, any final comment?
Thank you. Something short just to relate to the comment about the two-state solution. And of course, the two-state solution was already far away and many people doubted it. But I think what we see now emphasizes that there cannot be any other solution. You know, all these ideas about federation, confederation, one say, you know, we see how these are two people that want to have their national aspiration maintained within a sovereign space. And in Israel, there is a comeback of the discussion now about the PA returning to Gaza. That was something that you didn't hear among government circles, and now both our national security advisor, Tzachi Hanegbi, and other ministers from within the government, from within the right wing, are talking about the return of the Palestinian Authority to Gaza. Again, this is a new concept. They are not doing that because they become supporters of the two-state solution, but in practice, they are promoting conditions that were necessarily spelled out by the peace camp in Israel as though that without them, there cannot be a two-state solution, because as long as there is a divide between the West Bank and Gaza, no matter who is the leadership on either sides, the two-state solution cannot be materialized. But if this war eventually leads to some sort of a different reality in which this division is gone, and plus some leadership change in Israel, then we can at least begin to talk about the prospects for that once again. It's not an easy path, so many obstacles on the ground, but that's the only solution that can work. So even if it's difficult, I think it's our responsibility and our friends in the world to try and advance it as much as possible at any given time.
Great, thank you, Nimrod. Katerina, last comments on your side. You're muted. Could you unmute, please?
All right. So not really, other than underlining the last comments from Ambassador Zepos that the Arab Street might play an important role here, will play an important role, and to the extent that this can be contained is also in the interest of both Israel and the West more broadly. And of course, our theme of this webinar, any kind of further cooperation between Arab countries and Israel, linking India to Europe. I'm encouraged to hear what Mr. Gorin was saying about the start of a discussion about creating the conditions of the day after and how they may lead to a more sustainable situation going forward in the future.
Great, thank you. Dr. Anastasatos, I keep from you the dynamism of the private sector, and it is up to banks like Eurobank to maintain this potential through private sector, creating the space. We've seen it in other situations like the energy sector in the East Med, where the private sector and the capital commitment to the region opened the space for politics and collaboration amongst countries of the region, like the East Med Gas Forum and other fora. So any final comment on that point, the private sector creating space for politics to
I think I agree with you that the private sector initiatives are going to be instrumental in going forward with these initiatives, but allow me to state a more general conclusion that arises, I think, from the developments of recent years, starting from the pandemic, and then the war of Russia and Ukraine, and now the tragic events in Middle East. They all seem to underline the increasing, let's say, a reluctance of states and national economies to rely on remote and potentially unstable or less predictable trade partners. So some people have rushed into calling this the end of globalization. I don't think this is the end of globalization or global trade, but I think it does provide the rationale for multilateral cooperation between like-minded areas connected by cultural links, economic links, to go ahead. And the one we are discussing today is such an initiative, and that's why I'm relatively optimistic that this will go ahead.
Great, thank you. We couldn't hope for a better ending to our webinar today. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our audience. I will keep one comment that binds it all, that this is not an either-or situation of interconnectors. This is an alternative, a much-needed option for keeping multiple interconnectivity corridors open, both for people movement, for goods movement, and for capital movement. Thank you, Eliamep, for hosting us. Good night, all. Good morning to the rest.
Thank you. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.